Don't Let Me Die. Out of all the scary hospital stories we read, this is one of the creepiest. We'd paste it word for word, but we can't, so we'll have to tell it in our own words. We're sticking with the real details, though. Nurse J recounted her experience with a possession. A patient was suffering from many illnesses. Many patients are afraid to die, but he stood out very much. When his monitors beeped warning signals, he would rage at the nurses, screaming, "Don't let me die! Don't let me die!" Later, Nurse J and the other nurses found out why he was supremely agitated. At 2 o'clock, the man's cardiac monitor starts alarming VTAC. Nurse J and another nurse quickly went to his room, with Nurse J following closely behind because she was pulling the crash cart. She bumped into the first nurse, whom she noticed had turned very pale. She was looking at the bed. Their patient was sitting 2 inches above the bed. He was laughing with a demonic look on his face. He said, "You stupid bitches aren't going to let me die, will you?" He kept laughing, and Nurse J recounted how they were frozen on the spot. Still, she managed to hit code blue, and suddenly their patient went into VFib, crashing back into the bed as he did so. The nurses started coding him, but it was called after 20 minutes. 5 minutes later, the staff is cleaning up when the dead man sits up suddenly. He said, while laughing maniacally, "You let him die. Too bad." Their dead patient suddenly gave an agonized scream, and everybody heard whispers of, "Don't let me die." Nurse J recounted, "The night shift nurses had a prayer service in the break room before we left for home, and then we all had nightmares for weeks." The night shift. I used to work at an old, small hospital near the freeway, which just recently opened back up. It was closed for some time, but I will never go back there. I'm surprised to see that anyone did, considering what happened. I'm even more surprised that no one knew what was going on, including myself. Dr. Dubras is a chief of surgery, at least he was before they found out what he did to those kids. He specialized in brain surgery and was pretty good too. Having done so many interviews and on TV shows, you'd think so too. But there was something weird with his cases. He only wanted to work with children. He insisted on it, never adults, no matter how much a desperate patient begged. I always thought it was weird, but never thought much of it. But others did. Rumors started to spread in the hospital about him lying with the children when they were unconscious, but it was never confirmed. One night, as I was leaving to go home, I was asked to stay late by a friend to complete his rounds, so I did. I never worked the night shift before because it was too creepy, and they always had the worst cases. I didn't really know what to do, so I went looking for another doctor to fill me in and see if any of the other floors needed help, because it can get hectic down here around this time. When I walked into the break room, I saw Dr. Dubras. "Hi," I said. "Do you know what I'm supposed to do? I'm taking over a coworker's shift, but he didn't tell me." He cuts me off. "Stay on this floor and don't go into any OR rooms," he said slowly and with a dead face. He then walked out of the room and into the elevator. I watched him pass and didn't think much of it. He always spoke in such a monotone voice and looked depressed. I always thought it was because he was lonely. He didn't have a wife or kids and never spoke of his life outside the hospital, so I assumed he didn't have one. I continued to look for another doctor to actually help me, but after a while I gave up and started watching TV in an empty patient's room. But something was off, even though I was never there at night. It was just too quiet. So naturally, I wanted to walk around. I started to think about what he said. Why wouldn't he want me to go into the OR rooms the cleaners had left? So it doesn't make sense. I walked into the elevator and went up a couple floors, scared he would catch me. I ran out as soon as the doors opened and hid in the supply room. I gathered myself and peeked out the door. The hallway was empty. We only had 2 OR rooms upstairs, so it wouldn't be hard to find where he was if he was in one. I walked up to OR 1 and looked in, but it was empty and left. I slowly walked to OR 2. As I got closer, my heart began to pound. It felt as if it was going to burst. I started to sweat uncontrollably and was shaking. Trying so hard to control my breathing so he wouldn't hear me, I peeked into the room and my heart dropped. My eyes as wide as quarters, I held in my scream as I looked through the glass, astonished. I couldn't believe what I saw. There was a child on the table being operated on, his body cut open. Dr. Dubras with his kidney in his hand while a strange man with no scrubs held up the cooler for him to put it in. I looked over, and on the tray were small, chopped up pieces of a person. Trying to put together what was going on, the man with no scrubs looked up at me, his face unforgettable. I stepped back and started to run. When I got outside, I called 911, telling them what I saw. The police department was close to the hospital, so close you could hear the sirens as soon as I hung up. They came and arrested Dr. Dubrus, but they couldn't find the man with no scrubs. It got out later on the news about everything that happened and how much of a monster he was. The lawsuits started rolling in, and the hospital closed not soon after. It turns out he did have a wife. She was a lunch lady and a former chemist. She was poisoning the kids at school, changing schools frequently so she wouldn't get caught. The parents would later take the kid to the hospital, where Dr. Dubrus would tell them they had brain damage and that he could fix them with surgery. He would schedule these at night when there was very little traffic in the upper floors in the hospital, and take a kidney or whatever the buyer wanted and sell it on the black market, later telling the parents that their child hemorrhaged and he had to do surgery on the body. He also would shave and make an incision on the head, but did not operate there. No one ever questioned him. All his patients had fast, successful recoveries, and he was called a miracle doctor. When the police did more research, they figured out that Jerry wasn't his real name. It was Kevin. Dr. Dubrus was a brain surgeon in Texas who went missing. They later found out he used to work in the same hospital as him and found out what Kevin was up to. He admitted he killed him and took his name and job. When asked where his body was, he smiled and said, "Check the patients."